Hi, we've got a new story to read called The Gingerbread Bees. It's from Poland, our topic this term. There once was a little town called Turin, which always smelt of gingerbread. On spring mornings, when the breeze blew towards the river, merchants arriving there could smell the ginger wafting through the streets of bakeries. As soon as they unloaded their wares, they would rush to have breakfast in one of the little waterfront shops where tea and a gingerbread cake was sold. Smell the ginger. The most popular bakery of all was Bartholomew's, run by a man whose name was, not surprisingly, Mr. Bartholomew. This old baker had a prosperous business, and his reputation for baking excellent cakes was the talk of the whole town. "Your husband must be a happy man, Mrs. Bartholomew. Surely if anyone has a claim to happiness it would be him," said a customer one day, gingerbread crumbs dropping from her mouth as she spoke. "Mr. Bartholomew, happy?" replied his wife, brushing cake from her lap. "He won't be happy until the king tells him his gingerbread is the best in the country." She took another mouthful of tea to wash down the cake, then continued, "And he wishes he'd never hired that rascal of an apprentice, Bogumil." Cup of tea. It was known that Bartholomew had desires to marry his lovely daughter, with her honey hair and her blue eyes, to a wealthy man. It was equally known that the girl was not interested in the crusty old men who showered her with amber necklaces, silver ribbons, and pearl-embroidered gloves in a bid to win her affections, and that her heart was moved more by the bunches of wild flowers and gingerbread hearts given to her by young Bogumil. "Sack him, that's the only answer, husband. Sack him," said Mrs. Bartholomew one day, as she watched her daughter putting a bunch of freshly picked flowers into a vase. "For pity's sake, the lad can't even afford to buy his own flowers. What sort of husband would he make our Katarzyna? Sack him, I say." Her husband put a hand to his brow. "I can't sack him, my dear. The king is coming to Turin soon, and I need all the help I can get. Besides, Bogumil is a good baker." Light-hearted, happy-go-lucky Bogumil thought of nothing but Katarzyna by day and by night. Although he loved his work at the bakery, there were times when the young man longed only to get away from the hot ovens and walk dreamily through the forest looking for flowers for his love. So it was one morning that he was walking in a forest outside the town when he spotted a bunch of forget-me-nots growing beside a lake. They were as blue as Katarzyna's eyes. Bogumil was on his hands and knees and about to pick the flowers when he heard a faint droning sound. He looked up and saw a huge round black and yellow striped bumblebee drowning in the lake. Without thinking, Bogumil snatched up a giant sorrel leaf and, leaning out into the water, helped the bee clamber onto it. He put the leaf down upon the bank and, seeing that the bee's wings were wet, moved it to the sun. Soon the bee began to revive and start rubbing its wings. When it was dry, its buzzing grew louder, and eventually it flew off into the forest, leaving the young man alone. Bzzz. Bogumil was kneeling down again to pick the forget-me-nots when he heard the chirp of a small bird perched upon a twig at the side of the lake. Imagine his surprise when he looked closer and saw that it was not a bird at all, but a little woman no bigger than his middle finger, sitting not on a twig but on a throne. She wore a tiny crown upon her head. Bogumil bowed. The queen spoke, not in a chirp this time, but in a beautiful voice. "I am the queen of the honey dwellers, and I have come to reward you for your good deed." My people live on the golden honey made by the bees of this forest. When the queen bee fell into the lake, we thought that end had come, for without her bees she cannot work. If she had died, the worker bees would also have died, and there would have been no more honey for my people. Boggymill was speechless. Listen to me carefully, she continued, and you will become the most famous baker in Tyrone, and your town will be known forever as the gingerbread town. Remember, when you bake your gingerbread, as well as adding spices, to add a spoonful of honey to the recipe. And she gave him a little pot of forest honey. Then, before Boggymill could thank her, the queen disappeared. The throne had turned back into a twig, and there was a bird perched on it. Boggymill rubbed his eyes, not sure if he'd been dreaming, and forgetting about the flowers, ran all the way back to town. The streets were full of people. Boggymill stopped and asked a man what was happening. Good God, my boy, where on earth have you been? The king is coming to Tyrone tomorrow. Boggymill went red in the face. The king coming tomorrow? He must get back to the bakery at once. Old Bartholomew was furious when he saw his apprentice. The ovens in the kitchen were already hot, and the baker had rolled out his gingerbread dough. Where the devil have you been, you young scoundrel? Don't you know the king is coming tomorrow? He fumed. His wife shouted, Every apprentice in town is baking gingerbread except you. Get to work at once. Young Boggymill said sorry 1,000 times and quickly gathered together his cooking utensils. He added cloves, cinnamon, black pepper and ginger to his dough, and when the old baker and his wife were not looking, took out the jar of forest honey and added a spoonful to the mixture. He cut the gingerbread into different shapes, knights, flowers, hearts, and even bees. And in remembrance of the little queen, he cut out some tiny crowns too. Early the next morning, Bartholomew was up, banging on his apprentice's bedroom door. Up, you lazy rascal, there's work to be done. His wife was already up and about, laying a clean linen cloth over the table outside the bakery. Her husband carried out the trays of gingerbread, eyeing Boggymill's golden creations, which were arranged on a silver tray. That apprentice might have been a rascal, but there was no denying he had a gift for baking. There was such a gleam about gingerbread biscuits today, they might almost have been made of gold. Bartholomew didn't utter his thoughts out loud. Instead, he shouted, Boggymill, fetch a ladder, my boy, and polish the shop sign until it sparkles. Boggymill rubbed the old sign until he could see his face in the letters. Then, looking into it, he saw reflected the king's horses approaching the town. There was a great roar from the crowds in the streets, and turning round, he nearly fell off his ladder. Bartholomew shouted, Get down off that ladder, boy, and put it away. Then clean up your hands and get yourself out here, asked Mrs. Bartholomew. Boggymill meekly did as he was told. By the time the king arrived at Bartholomew's shop, he and the royal children were already stuffed full of gingerbread. The old baker silently cursed the fact that his shop was in the centre of town and so far along the royal route. When the king approached, Bartholomew bowed, his wife curtsied, and Boggymill held his breath as the king stepped forward and chose a gingerbread crown from the silver tray. The king's little son and daughter each picked up a gingerbread bee. The king ate one crown, then another and another. His children munched their way through a swarm of gingerbread bees and a bunch of gingerbread flowers. Who baked these biscuits? Cried the king. The old baker bowed again. Mrs. Bartholomew smiled smugly, and they both pointed at Boggymill. This is the most delicious gingerbread I have ever tasted, the king said. He picked up another gingerbread crown. Tell me, young man, what did you do to make this gingerbread so special? Bogomil told the king that he had added forest honey to the recipe, and the king nodded approvingly. "Ingenious," he said. Bartholomew smiled. "What a clever apprentice." "Get me a scribe at once," said the king, with a mouthful of Bogomil's biscuits. "I wish to grant this town a royal charter, and bestow upon it the exclusive right to bake honey gingerbread for the king's market." Bartholomew patted his young apprentice on the back, forgiving him from his errant ways. He promoted Bogomil to senior baker and gave him his daughter's hand in marriage. Bogomil was delighted by all of this, but he couldn't help wondering if his luck would run out once the little pot of honey was finished. He needn't have worried, for one afternoon when he was in the garden of his new cottage, he heard a faint buzzing and discovered that a swarm of bees had moved into one of his cherry trees. The little queen had sent them to Bogomil so he would never have to look for honey again. His gingerbread got better and better, and when old Bartholomew died, Bogomil took over the bakery and Tyrone became known as the gingerbread town. Bogomil lived happily with his beautiful wife, but he never told anyone about the little queen of the honey dwellers whom he had met long ago in the forest of bees.